Okay, thank you for joining me today once again, and in today's session we'll be looking at access control. So this session will be suitable for someone who's looking to sit the ISC2 CC exam or the CompTIA Security Plus exam. I'm Benjamin, and let's get started. Okay, so when we look at access control, there are three main types of access control, and the first one is what's known as DAC, or Discretionary Access Control. And so when we think about DAC, it's mostly deployed a lot in home kind of environment. And if you think about maybe your Google Drive, or you think about, let's say, your OneDrive, where you are able to actually decide who can access your files. You can actually share them with a particular email address that you wish to, and the file owner, which is you, gets to decide who can access the file. And when we look at Mac, it's mostly only deployed in corporate environments. Home environments, you wouldn't see something like Mac. And what Mac is basically a mandatory access control, and the access control is actually based on labels and classification level. So the very classic example would be the military kind of a system, where you have top secret, you have secret, and maybe you have restricted or publicly accessible. And only if you have the required security clearance are you able to access. A more contemporary example would be something called Azure Information Protection. And this is something that your company might have deployed. And what happens when you try to save actually a Word document or actually a PowerPoint file, you'll be asked if this is for internal use, which will prevent you from actually sharing it or emailing it out, or whether it's a customer communication, or whether it's meant for public dissemination. And this is actually something that is applied. A label is actually applied on the document itself, and it will actually restrict whoever can actually disseminate the document in future. Yeah. And finally, we look at what's known as RBAC, or Role-Based Access Control, and this is widely used in corporate deployments. And what happens is there will be multiple roles. For example, you might have a role which says your IT, you might have a role which says your HR, or you might have a role which says you're part of, let's say, manufacturing. And then there will be multiple users. For simplicity's sake, we'll just call them A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and maybe H as well. And what happens is that each of these users will belong to a certain role. And then based on which role they are belonging, run certain access. So for example, the IT can access maybe certain systems, and certain files. And HR can access their other HR systems and the HR files, and likewise for manufacturing. And the benefit of role-based access control is it's easy to actually ensure consistent access. So for example, if let's say E has left the company, what you need to do is just to remove E from the particular role, and automatically he cannot access all the files that manufacturing can access anymore. If we look at something such as discretionary access control, where access is actually given to individual members of the department, there may be multiple files which you might have to actually remove access from if someone leaves the company, and so it's a lot more messy when compared to something such as a role-based access control. Okay, with that done, let's quickly take a look at the questions. Okay, question 1. A company allows document owners to decide who can view and edit their files. Which access control model is being used? And here the keyword here is allow document owners to decide. So if the owner themselves can decide, it's definitely going to be DAC. And so this is the answer. Okay, looking at question 2, access to classified data is granted based on security clearance levels such as confidential, secret, and top secret. So this is the military example that we were talking about earlier. And so you need to have a clearance, and that clearance will allow you to access classified data in that tier. And so this is a mandatory access control, or MAC. Question 3. Employees in the finance department automatically receive access to payroll systems based on their job functions. Which access control does this represent? Okay, so we have seen this earlier as well. So we were talking about systems, and then we were talking about roles, and then we are talking about the users or the employees. And so in this example, we have payroll system. We might have certain files related to payroll and things like that. And all these are actually mapped into the finance role. And then whichever employee joins in, let's say B newly joins the team, they will just be allocated this role, and they have access to all of this system automatically. And so this is RBAC here. Okay. Question 4. A firewall allows access to a system only during business hours and blocks traffic from certain geographic locations. Which access control is being applied? Okay, so this is definitely not RBAC. There are no roles involved here. This is also definitely not MAC, so we are not actually classifying or labeling the documents. And it's not DAC as well, because the owners are not the ones granting access. So this is something new. It's called rule-based access control. And so basically there are certain rules such as allowing only during business hours, allowing based on certain locations, and this is an example of a rule-based access control, which is C. Okay, question 5. Access to an application is granted only if the user is part of a HR department, the login occurs from the corporate network, and the request happens during working hours. Which model best describes this? So this is definitely role-based, so RBAC. This here sounds a bit like rule-based, and when we look at it as a whole, there's a combination of rule-based, as well as other kinds of mechanisms. So this is something that is known as ABAC, or attribute-based access control. And what attribute-based access control does is it has a policy engine, and you will actually evaluate multiple attributes. It could be the role, it could be the rules and things like that, and you will use this information to actually determine if access should be granted. And so the answer for this question should be B. Okay, question 6. A system ensures that no employee can both approve and process the same financial transaction. So both approve and process. Which access control principle is being enforced? Okay, so this is something new as well. So if you look at list privilege, what we are trying to determine, or what we are trying to enforce, is that to make sure that the employee has only the amount of privilege that they require to fulfill their duties, as only what's required. So there's no excess privilege, and this is very important to make sure that in the event that the employee is compromised, there won't be a wider blast radius than what is actually intended or required. And what we are looking at here in this question is actually something called separation of duty. And so what's happening here is actually that there are two operations going on, approving as well as processing, and we are making sure that a different set of employees can actually perform these functions, and so there's no overlap, and C cannot both approve and process the transaction. And so this is called separation of duties, and it's to prevent one corrupt employee from actually performing a high value transaction. Okay, for option C itself, need to know, it's related a lot to do with MAC, and so MAC actually enforces need to know. If you're not at a level, or not at a security clearance where you need to know certain information, then you'll not be given access to it. So when you see need to know, the keyword need to know, it's a lot of times has to do with MAC, and discretionary access is that once again, which is doesn't apply here. Okay, question 7. Which access control model provides the most centralized and strict enforcement of access permissions? So when we look at what's centralized and what's strict, definitely DAC is out. Because DAC, the owner can control, so it's not centralized. Everybody who owns a file, they can control access to their own file. So it's definitely not DAC. RBAC is kind of centralized, because most likely it's the IT department who's able to assign roles. But when we are looking at strict enforcement, what comes to mind most is MAC. If you don't have the appropriate security clearance level to be able to access, there's very strict enforcement that you won't be allowed to access the document at all. RBAC, there's still some room, you can still add that person to a role, and it's possible, over time to have scope creep where a person is assigned multiple roles and they are able to be able to access multiple documents, even though they may not require that. So MAC is actually the most strict in terms of enforcement, and so the answer for this question is C. Okay, looking at the last question, question 8. A user has administrative privileges but is given access only to systems necessary for their role. And we look at the keyword here, it's only things that are necessary for their role. So immediately this is something that we are looking at list privilege. Why is it not need to know? Because need to know, it's a lot of MAC. Separation of duties, again, there are two parties involved in separation of duties. Over here in this question, there's only one party, which is the administrator, or the user itself. And there's no rules that we're looking at here. So list privilege means only you only have access to what is strictly necessary for your role. And so the answer for this question would be B. And that's it. I hope you've managed to gain something from this session here, and please subscribe and I'll see you in future sessions. Thank you.